Every parent's worst nightmare came true for Evan Rourke when his 7-year-old daughter vanished in Death Valley. What makes his story different is that she came back, something that hadn't happened in over a century. For 13 decades, children have disappeared in that desert without a trace. Every 13 years, like clockwork, families search. Families grieve. Families never get answers. But Maisie Rourke broke the pattern. When Evan found her sitting in the sand at dawn, she whispered about metal places underground and children without shadows. She drew pictures of corridors that shouldn't exist. As Evan searches for the truth, he discovers traces of a hidden research facility buried beneath the desert floor. The deeper he digs, the more dangerous it becomes. Some secrets were meant to stay buried forever. What really happened to all those missing children over the years, and why was his little girl the only one allowed to come home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Death Valley in shades of amber and rust, the same colors that had haunted Evan Rourke's dreams for the past 3 weeks. He stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching 7-year-old Maisie build elaborate sandcastles in their backyard. From a distance, she looked like any other child at play. It was only when you got closer that you noticed the deliberate precision of her movements, the way she carved intricate tunnels and chambers that seemed to follow some internal blueprint no 7-year-old should possess. "Daddy, the coffee's making your face all wrinkly again." Evan turned to find Maisie standing in the doorway, her small hands dusty with sand, those wide brown eyes, so much like her mother's, studying him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. 3 weeks ago, those same eyes had been vacant, staring at nothing as she sat cross-legged in the desert sand at dawn, barefoot and whispering about metal places that existed beneath the earth, just thinking. "Oh, sweetheart." He set down his mug and crouched to her level. "How are you feeling today?" "The same as yesterday, and the day before." She tilted her head, a gesture that had become increasingly common since her return. "The dreams are getting clearer, though. I can see their faces now." A chill ran down Evan's spine, despite the desert heat already building. Outside, Dr. Sarah Chen had warned him that Maisie might experience vivid dreams, as her mind processed whatever trauma she'd endured during those missing 18 hours. What the child psychologist hadn't expected were dreams with the kind of specific, consistent details that Maisie provided, details about children from different decades, children whose disappearances matched historical records with unsettling accuracy. The sound of gravel crunching under tires announced Sheriff Martinez's arrival. Evan had called him the night before, after finding Maisie sleepwalking toward the desert, muttering coordinates in her sleep. Numbers that, when plugged into a GPS, pointed to a location 30 miles deeper into Death Valley than anyone had any business being. "Uncle Ray's here," Maisie announced, though Sheriff Raymond Martinez wasn't actually her uncle. In a town of barely 800 people, such distinctions mattered less than they might elsewhere. Ray had been Evan's closest friend since childhood, had stood as best man at his wedding, and had led the search party that found Maisie when she disappeared. Ray knocked once before letting himself in. His weathered face creased with the kind of worry that had become permanent fixture since Maisie's return. At 52, he'd seen enough strange things in his 30 years of desert law enforcement to know when something fell outside normal parameters. Missing children who returned with detailed knowledge of other missing children definitely qualified. "Coffee's fresh," Evan offered, though he knew Ray would decline. The sheriff had given up caffeine years ago, claiming it made him too jittery for the job. "Thanks, but I can't stay long." Got a call from the county this morning. Ray's eyes found Maisie, who had settled at the kitchen table with her ever-present sketchpad. "They're sending someone to talk to her." "What kind of someone?" "Federal someone. The kind that asks questions I'm not qualified to answer." Evan felt his jaw tighten. He'd been expecting this, dreading it. Maisie's case had already attracted attention from the state police, child services, and now federal investigators. Each new official brought the same skeptical look, the same carefully worded questions about what really happened during those missing hours. When? This afternoon. Maybe sooner. Ray lowered his voice. Evan, I've been sheriff here for 18 years. I've handled missing persons cases, domestic disputes, the occasional tourist who got lost and died of exposure. But this, what happened to Maisie, it's different. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. From her seat at the table, Maisie looked up from her drawing. Are you talking about the pattern again? Both men turned to stare at her. She'd been listening, of course. Since her return, Maisie seemed to hear everything, as if her senses had been somehow sharpened by whatever she'd experienced. What pattern, sweetheart? Evan asked carefully, the one Uncle Ray keeps in his filing cabinet. The folder with all the pictures. Maisie's crayon moved across the paper with steady strokes. 13 years. Always 13 years. Like a clock that only chimes once every 13 years. Ray's face had gone pale. The folder she mentioned was locked in his office, classified information that had never been discussed in front of her. Information about disappearances stretching back to the 1890s, when the first recorded case appeared in territorial records. A child named Thomas Whitmore, age 7, who vanished while playing near his family's mining camp. No trace ever found, no explanation ever given. How do you know about that folder? Ray's voice was barely above a whisper. Maisie continued coloring, her small tongue poking out in concentration. I saw it in the dream. You were showing it to the man with the glasses. The one who's coming today. The kitchen fell silent, except for the soft scratch of crayon on paper. Evan moved closer to see what she was drawing. Another corridor, this one with doors lining both sides. Each door had a number above it, and in front of several doors, small figures that looked like children. Maisie, in this dream. Did you see the man's name? The one with glasses? Agent Morrison. He has questions about the metal place, but he already knows the answers. She looked up, her brown eyes serious beyond her years. He's scared, Daddy. Scared of what happens if people find out the truth. Ray grabbed Evan's arm. We need to talk. Outside, now. They stepped onto the front porch, the desert air already shimmering with heat, despite the early hour. Evan's small house sat on the outskirts of Beatty, Nevada, close enough to Death Valley that the landscape beyond his backyard stretched endlessly toward barren mountains. It was isolated, quiet, and usually peaceful. Everything he'd wanted when he'd moved here after his wife's death 5 years ago. Now that isolation felt more like vulnerability. How the hell does she know about Agent Morrison? Ray's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. I got the call about him 30 minutes ago. I haven't told anyone his name, haven't written it down anywhere. The only way she could know is if she's somehow connected to whatever happened to her out there. Evan finished the thought, his own fear crystallizing into something approaching certainty. Ray, I need to show you something. He led the sheriff around to the back of the house, where Maisie had been playing earlier. The sandcastles she'd built weren't random child's play. They were architectural models, complete with entrance tunnels, multiple levels, and what appeared to be ventilation shafts. The largest structure had been carefully carved to show internal corridors that matched the drawings she'd been making for weeks. The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind moving across the desert. Evan could feel his daughter's heartbeat, steady and calm, while his own pulse hammered against his temples. Morrison cleared his throat. Maisie, when you say machine, what exactly do you mean? The big round thing with all the lights. It spins really fast and makes a humming sound, like when Daddy's truck engine is cold. She pointed to a section of her drawing that Evan hadn't noticed before, a circular object covered in geometric patterns. It picks children to go through the bright doorway, but sometimes it picks them to stay and be helpers. Helpers for what? For the people in white coats. The ones who write down numbers and take pictures. Maisie's voice carried the matter-of-fact tone children use when explaining something obvious to confused adults. They've been doing it for a really long time. Since before cars, since before electricity. Agent Chen reached slowly for the drawing, as if handling something radioactive. Maisie, these names you've written, do you know how old these children were when they went to the metal place? 7. They're all 7. Just like me. She looked up at her father with those two knowing eyes. That's the right age for the machine to work. Any older and the energy isn't pure enough. Any younger and they can't survive the process. Evan's blood turned to ice. What process? But before Maisie could answer, Morrison's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his already pale face went ashen. We need to go now. The interview isn't finished, Chen began. It is now. Morrison stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Mr. Rourke, for your daughter's safety, I strongly advise you not to discuss this conversation with anyone. Anyone at all? Is that a threat? Morrison paused at the door, his hand on the knob. It's a warning. There are people who've spent considerable resources ensuring this matter stays buried. Your daughter's return has created complications. After they left, Evan held Maisie close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. She felt so small, so fragile, yet she carried knowledge that apparently terrified federal agents. Daddy, are you scared? A little, he admitted. Are you? No. The children with no shadows told me something important. She pulled back to look at his face. They said my grandfather tried to help them once. A long time ago. He had a special key that could open all the doors. Evan's heart stopped. Maisie, what kind of key? She slipped from his lap and disappeared into her room, returning moments later with something that made his breath catch. It was a military dog tag, corroded and stained, hanging from a chain that had seen better decades. The name stamped into the metal read, Rourke Jackson M. Below that, a serial number and classification code that Evan didn't recognize. But what made his hands shake as he took the tag was the additional information stamped along the bottom edge. Project Lazarus, Temporal Research Division, Clearance Level 9. Where did you find this? It was around my neck when you found me in the desert, but I hid it until now. Maisie's voice was small, uncertain for the first time since her return. The bad people are looking for it. They don't know I have it, but they know it exists. Evan stared at the dog tag, pieces of an impossible puzzle finally beginning to form a picture. His father hadn't been a construction worker or a drifter. He'd been a government researcher working on something called Project Lazarus, something involving temporal research and missing children, something he'd tried to stop, and now, 30 years later, his granddaughter had returned from the same nightmare he'd died trying to expose, carrying the one piece of evidence that could prove it all. The phone rang, making them both jump. Evan answered on the third ring, expecting Sheriff Martinez or Dr. Chen. Instead, he heard a voice he didn't recognize, cold, professional, and utterly without warmth. Mr. Rourke, you have something that belongs to the United States government. Something that your father stole before his unfortunate accident 30 years ago. Who is this? Someone who prefers to remain anonymous. You have 24 hours to return what was taken. If you cooperate, your daughter can continue living a normal life. If you don't, well, the desert is a dangerous place. Children disappear there all the time. The line went dead. Evan stared at the phone, then at his daughter, who was watching him with those impossibly knowing eyes. They're coming for us, aren't they? She asked quietly. Yeah, sweetheart. I think they are. Good, Maisie said, her small chin lifting with determination that reminded him achingly of her mother. The children with no shadows have been waiting a long time for someone to let them come home. She held up the dog tag, its metal surface catching the desert sunlight streaming through the window. Grandpa Jack gave me the key. Daddy, now we just have to figure out how to use it. The Beatty Public Library wasn't much to look at, a converted double-wide trailer with a faded sign and a collection that hadn't seen significant updates since the Clinton administration. But it had something Evan desperately needed. Internet access that couldn't be traced back to his home, and a librarian who remembered the old days. Martha Hendricks was 73 years old and had lived in Beatty her entire life. More importantly, she'd been here during what she called the construction years, the late 1980s and early 1990s, when mysterious government contractors had swarmed the area, supposedly building infrastructure for expanded mining operations. Your father was here during that time, Martha told Evan as she pulled dusty boxes from a storage closet. Good man, Jack Rourke. Asked a lot of questions, though. Some folks thought maybe too many questions. Evan sat at one of the library's 3 computer terminals, supposedly researching geological surveys while actually diving into government land acquisition records. What he'd found in the past 2 hours painted a disturbing picture. In 1987, the Department of Energy had quietly purchased nearly 40,000 acres of Death Valley land through a series of shell companies. The purchases were buried in bureaucratic paperwork, disguised as routine acquisitions for environmental monitoring and geological research, but the timing corresponded exactly with the first. References to Project Lazarus in his father's journal. Mrs. Hendricks, do you remember anything unusual about the construction crews? Anything that didn't seem quite right? Maisie, come here. Evan kept his voice level, but his hand moved instinctively toward the small of his back, where he sometimes carried a pistol, though he'd left it in the truck today. It's okay. Daddy, she's not really Dr. Chen anymore. Maisie's matter-of-fact tone was somehow more unsettling than if she'd been crying. She's one of the Watchers. They replace people sometimes, when they need to gather information. The thing wearing Dr. Chen's face smiled, but the expression didn't reach those mirror-like eyes. Your daughter is quite remarkable, Mr. Rourke. Most subjects don't retain such clear memories after exposure to the temporal field. It makes her uniquely valuable to our research. Ray had his service weapon drawn, though he kept it pointed at the floor. Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to step away from the child. Sheriff Martinez. The Chen thing turned its unsettling gaze toward him. You've been investigating matters that don't concern you. That ends now. She reached into her purse, not for a weapon, but for what looked like a small electronic device. When she pressed a button, Ray's eyes suddenly went blank. His gun clattered to the floor as he stood motionless, staring at nothing. Uncle Ray. Maisie's voice finally carried a note of fear. He's fine. Just temporarily disconnected. The Chen thing turned back to Evan. Now, about your father's research notes. The document your daughter found is quite interesting, but incomplete. We need the rest of the files. Evan looked at the burned paper on the table. What remained showed part of a hand-drawn map and fragments of text that included phrases like temporal anchor coordinates and emergency shutdown. Sequence. I don't have any other files. Of course you do. Jackson Rourke was many things, but he wasn't careless. He hid backup copies of his research, along with evidence of our operations. Evidence that could cause considerable problems if it fell into the wrong hands. Maisie slid the dog tag across the table toward her father. Show her the secret, Daddy. The one Grandpa Jack hid in the metal. Evan picked up the tag, turning it over in his hands. He'd examined it dozens of times since Maisie had shown it to him, but now he looked more carefully. The surface was corroded and stained, but as he held it up to the kitchen light, he could see something unusual about the metal itself. There were tiny perforations in the steel, holes so small they were barely visible to the naked eye, arranged in a pattern that looked almost like, "It's a punch card," he said, understanding flooding through him. The holes form a pattern. Data storage. The Chen thing leaned forward, its silver eyes reflecting his face like funhouse mirrors. Your father was always clever. He encoded the shutdown sequence for Project Lazarus into his identification tag, then made sure it stayed with the family. A dead man's switch, in case something happened to him. What shutdown sequence? The one that would collapse the temporal containment field and release every child we've collected over the past century. The thing's smile was predatory now. Your father built a back door into our systems. We've spent 30 years looking for it. Maisie stood up from her chair and walked calmly to where Sheriff Martinez stood frozen. She took his hand, and something strange happened. His eyes cleared, the blankness fading as awareness returned. What the hell? Ray stumbled backward, looking around in confusion. She's learning to manipulate the field, the Chen thing observed, with what might have been admiration. Fascinating. Most subjects require years of conditioning before they develop such control. What field? Evan demanded. The temporal displacement field that surrounds this entire region. Think of it as a bubble where time moves differently, slower in some areas, faster in others, occasionally flowing backward. The thing gestured toward the window, where the desert stretched endlessly toward the mountains. Your daughter spent 18 hours inside the central processing chamber. That exposure changed her on a quantum level. Ray had retrieved his weapon and now had it trained on the Chen thing. You're talking about time travel, not travel, manipulation. We don't move through time, we bring time to us. Specifically, we anchor children at age 7 in a temporal loop, harvesting their quantum energy to power increasingly sophisticated experiments. Evan felt sick. You're feeding off them. Their life force. We're advancing human knowledge of temporal mechanics. The children we process become part of something greater than themselves. Their sacrifice enables breakthroughs that will eventually benefit all mankind, except they're not sacrificing anything, Maisie said quietly. They're being murdered, slowly, over and over again, the Chen thing's silver eyes fixed on her. You shouldn't remember the processing chamber. The memory wipe is supposed to be permanent. The memory wipe didn't work because I'm not just 7 years old anymore. Maisie's voice carried a strange, echoing quality now, as if multiple voices were speaking in harmony. I'm also 8 and 9 and 10, and every age I would have been if you hadn't stolen those years from me. All those timelines exist in my head now. The kitchen lights began to flicker. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, subsonic hum. The same sound Evan had heard coming from the ventilation shaft. Temporal cascade failure, the Chen thing said, and for the first time it looked concerned. She's destabilizing the local field matrix. Good, Evan said grimly. Maisie, can you free the other children? Not from here. The anchor point is too far away. She looked at her father with those 2 knowing eyes. But Grandpa Jack's key can get us there. If we can reach the central chamber, I can use what they taught me to set everyone free. The Chen thing stood abruptly. That cannot be allowed to happen. Too much depends on the project's continuation. It reached for another device in its purse, but Ray was faster. His shot took the thing's center mass, spinning it around. But instead of falling, it straightened up, the bullet hole already beginning to close. Enhanced durability is one of the benefits of our symbiotic relationship with the temporal field, it explained almost apologetically. Physical damage is temporary, but this body is becoming unstable. I'll need to find a replacement soon. Its silver eyes fixed on Ray with predatory interest. Run, Maisie said urgently. All of us. Right now, they didn't need to be told twice. Evan scooped up his daughter while Ray provided cover, and they headed for the back door. Behind them, the Chen thing was changing, its skin rippling like water, its features becoming fluid and undefined. The truck, Evan shouted as they burst into the backyard. They made it halfway across the yard before the house exploded. The blast wasn't fire and shrapnel, it was something far stranger. Reality seemed to fold in on itself around the kitchen, creating a spiral of distorted space that made Evan's eyes water to look at directly. The Chen thing stood at the center of the distortion, no longer human in any recognizable sense. Temporal implosion, Maisie said as they reached the truck. It's collapsing this timeline to prevent information leakage. What does that mean? Ray demanded as they piled into the cab. It means we have about 30 seconds before this entire area gets sucked into a time loop, Evan said, gunning the engine. And if we're caught in it, we'll be stuck repeating the same moment forever. As they raced away from the house, Evan could see the distortion expanding in his rearview mirror, swallowing trees, fence posts, and anything else in its path. The air behind them shimmered like heat waves, but cold emanated from the growing void. Where are we going? Ray asked. Evan looked at the dog tag in his hand, then at his daughter, who was studying the partially burned document with the intense focus of someone far older than 7. We're going to finish what my father started, he said. We're going to shut down Project Lazarus permanently. Maisie looked up from the document, her brown eyes reflecting depths that shouldn't exist in a child. The coordinates are here, Daddy. The anchor point is 37 miles northeast of town, in the deepest part of the facility. How deep? 2 miles underground. Where the desert meets the center of the earth, and time forgets how to move forward. In the rearview mirror, Evan watched his house disappear completely, leaving nothing but empty desert and a faint shimmer in the air. Whatever forces they were up against, they had just demonstrated that they were willing to erase reality itself to protect their secrets. But they had also made a critical mistake. They had let Jackson, Rourke's granddaughter, live long enough to learn how their own weapons worked, and now she was going to use that knowledge against them. The Riverside Motel sat on the outskirts of Pahrump, Nevada, 40 miles from where Evan's house had been erased from existence. It was the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions about guests who paid in cash. Perfect for people who needed to disappear, at least temporarily. Evan spread the contents of his father's journal across the motel room's small table, while Ray worked the phones, calling in favors from law enforcement contacts across the state. Maisie sat cross-legged on the bed, carefully arranging photographs of missing children that she'd somehow produced from her backpack. Photographs that hadn't been there when they'd fled the house. Where did these come from? Evan asked, studying images of children from different decades. The photos were professional quality, the kind taken in school portraits, but they showed kids who had supposedly vanished without a trace. The watchers keep records, Maisie explained matter-of-factly. When I was in the processing chamber, I saw their filing system. It's very organized. They have pictures, medical records, psychological profiles, everything about each child they've taken. Ray finished his call and joined them at the table. His face was grim. I've got good news and bad news. Good news is 3 other sheriffs in neighboring counties have been tracking similar disappearances. They're willing to meet with us. Bad news is this thing is bigger than we thought. He pulled out a notebook filled with names, dates, and locations. Sheriff Rodriguez in Esmeralda County has been documenting missing children cases for 15 years. Sheriff Thompson in Nye County has files going back to the 1970s. And get this, Sheriff Walsh in Inyo County, California, has been investigating what she calls the 13-year curse since she took office. Evans studied the notebook. The pattern was undeniable. Every 13 years, across a region covering parts of 3 states, children disappeared, always around age 7, always without a trace, and always in areas that shared certain geological characteristics. It's not just Death Valley, he realized. It's the entire Basin and Range province. They've got facilities scattered across hundreds of square miles. Maisie looked up from arranging photographs. Not facilities. One facility, very big, very deep. The desert is like an iceberg. Most of it is underground. She produced another item from her backpack that made both men stare, a 3-dimensional map that appeared to be carved from some kind of crystal. The surface showed the familiar topography of the region, but translucent layers revealed a vast underground complex stretching from California to Utah. Where did you get that? Ray whispered. I made it. While you were on the phone, Maisie traced patterns in the crystal with her finger, and sections of the underground map began to glow. The temporal field gives me access to quantum probability structures. I can see things that haven't happened yet, or that happened a long time ago. The glowing sections formed a network that connected sites across 3 states, Death Valley, the Nevada test site, Area 51, and dozens of smaller installations, all linked by underground tunnels and what appeared to be some kind of transportation system. My God, Evan breathed. It's not just one secret project. It's an entire hidden infrastructure, built over the course of a century, Maisie confirmed. They started with natural cave systems and expanded them using technology that doesn't officially exist. The missing children provide the quantum energy needed to power the temporal manipulation systems. Ray pointed to one of the larger glowing nodes on the map. What's this one? It's bigger than all the others. Central processing, where they keep the anchor children, the ones who've been in the system the longest. Their quantum signatures are used to stabilize the entire network. Maisie's voice carried a sadness that was heartbreaking in a 7-year-old. "Some of them have been down there for 50 years, living the same day over and over again." The motel room door opened without a knock, and 3 people entered, 2 men and a woman, all wearing sheriff's uniforms from different counties. They moved with the easy coordination of people who'd worked together before, despite officially being from separate jurisdictions. "Martinez," the woman said, nodding to Ray. "Thanks for reaching out. I'm Sheriff Walsh in your county. These are Sheriffs Rodriguez and Thompson." Introductions were brief and professional, but Evan could see the shared weight these people carried. They'd all been dealing with inexplicable disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and the kind of bureaucratic obstruction that suggested federal involvement. "Show them the photos," Ray said to Maisie. She gathered the photographs into neat piles, organizing them by decade. "These are the children currently being held in temporal stasis," she said with the clinical precision of someone much older. "These are the ones who were processed and released. Their quantum energy was drained completely. And these," she indicated a smaller pile, "are the anchor children." Sheriff Walsh picked up one of the photos from the anchor pile. It showed a young boy with dark hair and serious eyes. "Jesus Christ. This is Michael Hendricks. He disappeared from our jurisdiction in 1976. He'd be 46 years old now." "He's still 7, Maisie said quietly. "They all are. Time doesn't move forward in the anchor chambers. It just repeats the same moment over and over again, forever." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sheriff Rodriguez was the first to speak, his voice hoarse with emotion. "How many?" Maisie counted silently, her lips moving as she tallied numbers only she could see. 237 children currently in stasis, 43 anchor children providing core stability, and she paused, her young face clouding with something that might have been guilt. 1,612 who were completely drained and discarded. Sheriff Thompson slammed his fist on the table, making the crystal map jump. "Over 1,600 dead kids and nobody knows? How is that possible?" "Because they're very good at making problems disappear," Ray said grimly. "Evan's house got erased from reality this morning, like it never existed. Anyone who gets too close to the truth gets the same treatment." Evan studied the faces around the table, law enforcement officers who dedicated their careers to protecting people, now confronting evidence of crime so vast and systematic they defied comprehension. But he could see something else in their expressions: determination. "What do we need to do?" Sheriff Walsh asked. Maisie looked at each of them in turn, her brown eyes carrying depths that shouldn't exist in a child. "We need to reach the central processing chamber and use Grandpa Jack's shutdown sequence. But it won't be easy. The facility has defenses, temporal distortions, reality anchors, guards who aren't entirely human anymore." She touched the crystal map, and new details appeared: security checkpoints, patrol routes, and what looked like automated defense systems. "How do you know all this?" Sheriff Rodriguez asked. "Because I was there for longer than 18 hours, Maisie admitted. "From my perspective, I spent 3 months in that place. They were studying me, trying to understand why I retained my memories. I learned how their systems work." Evan felt his heart break a little more. His 7-year-old daughter had endured months of imprisonment and experimentation, maintaining her sanity through sheer force of will while gathering intelligence that could bring down their captors. "The entrance we found today, is that the only way in?" he asked. "No, there are 17 access points across the region, but most of them are heavily guarded or require special authorization codes." Maisie traced a route on the crystal map. "There's one that's less secure. An old mining tunnel that connects to the waste disposal system. We can get in that way, but we'll have to move quickly once we're inside." Sheriff Walsh leaned forward. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "The next temporal alignment begins in 6 hours, Maisie said. "That's when they'll process the children they've been holding. If we don't stop them before then, 237 kids will be permanently lost. And if we do stop them, then every child taken over the past century goes free. The anchor children will age to their proper timeline, 40, 50, 60 years old in a matter of minutes. Some of them might not survive the transition, but they'll have a chance to live real lives again. The weight of that responsibility settled over the room like a shroud. They were talking about a rescue operation that could save hundreds of lives, or doom them all if something went wrong. "We'll need equipment," Thompson said, already thinking tactically. "Weapons, communications gear, medical supplies for the children we're hoping to rescue, and we'll need a way to get past their security systems," Rodriguez added. "If these people can erase houses from existence, they're not going to be stopped by conventional law." Enforcement tactics. Maisie reached into her backpack one more time and produced something that made everyone in the room take a step back, a device that looked like a cross between a walkie-talkie and a ray gun. Its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. "Temporal disruptor," she explained. "I took it from the processing chamber when I escaped. It can neutralize their reality anchors and disrupt their defense systems. But it only has enough charge for one use." Evan stared at his daughter, this remarkable little girl who had survived horrors that would break most adults and emerged with knowledge that could change everything. "Maisie, are you sure about this? Once we go in there, there's no turning back." She nodded solemnly. "The children with no shadows have been waiting for someone to set them free. Grandpa Jack tried to do it 30 years ago, but he ran out of time. Now it's our turn." Sheriff Walsh stood up, her decision made. "I'm in. Those kids have been waiting long enough." "Me too," Rodriguez said. "My daughter would be about the same age as some of these children. If she were trapped down there, I'd want someone to come for her." Thompson nodded his agreement. "Count me in." Ray looked at Evan. "You don't have to do this. You could take Maisie and disappear, start over somewhere they'll never find you." "No," Evan said firmly. "My father died trying to stop these bastards. I'm going to finish what he started." As they began planning the assault on Project Lazarus, none of them noticed the small drone hovering outside the motel window, its cameras recording every word they spoke. In a facility 2 miles beneath the desert floor, enhanced beings that had once been human watched the feeds with interest. The children would be coming home soon. All of them. The old radio crackled to life at 3:17 a.m., filling the motel room with static and fragments of voices speaking in languages that didn't quite sound human. Maisie sat up in bed, fully alert, despite having been asleep moments before. "They're talking about us," she said quietly, not wanting to wake the adults who were catching a few hours of rest before the mission. "The enhanced guards are coordinating search patterns." Evan was awake instantly, his father's instincts overriding his exhaustion. "Can you understand what they're saying?" "Some of it." After prolonged exposure to the temporal field, language becomes more fluid. They're speaking in quantum harmonics, words that exist in multiple states simultaneously. Maisie tilted her head, listening to the incomprehensible chatter. "They know we're planning something, but they don't know where we are yet." Ray stirred from his position in the chair by the window. "How long before they find us?" "Maybe 2 hours, maybe less." She looked at the audio recording device that Sheriff Walsh had produced from her patrol car, an old cassette recorder that looked like it had seen better decades. "But I found something while you were sleeping." "Play the tape." Walsh had discovered the recording in her predecessor's files. Labeled simply Testimony M. Hendricks, 1976. The voice that emerged from the speakers was that of an elderly woman, speaking with the measured cadence of someone who knew she might not be believed. "My boy Michael, he came back different," the voice said. "Only for one night, you understand. Appeared in his room like he'd never been gone, but he was changed. Older in some ways, younger in others. He told me things, terrible things about where he'd been. The recording quality was poor, full of static and background noise, but Maisie had somehow enhanced it during her time alone with the device. Now they could hear details that had been previously inaudible. He said there were hundreds of children down there, in rooms made of light and metal. They're kept in a place where Tuesday never becomes Wednesday, where 7 years old lasts forever. But some of them remember, Remember being older. Remember families they haven't seen in decades. Sheriff Rodriguez had awakened and was listening intently. This woman's son, he escaped. For 12 hours, Maisie said sadly. They have retrieval protocols for anchor children who manage to breach the temporal barriers. By morning, he was gone again. But he'd left something behind. The recording continued. Michael drew me a map, with his crayons like he was still just a little boy. But the map showed things no child should know, tunnels and chambers, machines that bend time itself. He told me there was a way to shut it all down, but it required someone from the outside, someone with the right key. My father's dog tag, Evan realized. Jackson Rourke was mentioned by name, the old woman's voice continued. Michael said there was a man who tried to help them, a man who built a secret way out. But the man disappeared before he could use it. The tape ended with a burst of static, but the silence that followed was heavy with implication. Sheriff Thompson was studying the crystal map Maisie had created, tracing the underground networks with his finger. If this recording is accurate, we're not just attempting a rescue mission, he said slowly. We're completing a prison break that's been in progress for 30 years, Maisie nodded. Grandpa Jack designed the shutdown sequence to be activated by his family line. DNA-locked protocols that can only be triggered by someone carrying his genetic markers. You or me, Evan said. Both of us, actually. The system requires dual authentication, adult and child genetic patterns from the same family tree. It was designed to prevent accidental activation. Ray checked his watch. We need to move soon if we're going to reach the access point before dawn. Once the sun comes up, their surveillance systems will have better visibility. As they gathered their equipment, Maisie produced one more item from her seemingly bottomless backpack, a small, crystalline device that pulsed with soft blue light. What's that one? Walsh asked. Emergency beacon. If something goes wrong, if we get separated or captured, this will send a signal to every enhanced being in the facility. Maisie's voice was matter-of-fact, but Evan could hear the underlying fear. It will also begin a 24-hour countdown to complete system collapse. Complete system collapse. The temporal containment field that holds all those children in stasis without constant maintenance, it becomes unstable. If the facility is compromised and we can't complete the shutdown sequence properly, this beacon will ensure that the children are released one way or another. The implication was clear. If they failed in their mission, the beacon would trigger a catastrophic failure that would free the trapped children, but potentially kill them in the process. It was a dead man's switch with the highest possible stakes. There's something else, Maisie continued, her young face grave. The enhanced beings that guard the facility, they're not just employees. They're children who were successfully processed years ago. Their consciousness merged with the temporal field itself. They're victims, just like the ones we're trying to save. Evan felt sick. How many? 47 that I counted. Some of them have been guards for decades, their humanity slowly eroding as they become more integrated with the quantum systems. She looked directly at her father. One of them might be someone you know. The words hung in the air like a curse. In a region where children had been disappearing for over a century, where families had been torn apart by inexplicable losses, the possibility that some of the guards were local children who'd been transformed into something inhuman was almost too horrible to contemplate. Sheriff Rodriguez broke the silence. We save who we can, but we can't let sentiment compromise the mission. They loaded their vehicles in the pre-dawn darkness, dividing equipment and personnel across multiple cars in case they were spotted. The crystal map rode in Evan's truck, its soft glow hidden beneath a blanket. The temporal disruptor was secured in a lead-lined case that Maisie claimed would prevent it from being detected by the facility's sensors. As they prepared to leave the motel, Maisie took her father's hand. Daddy, when we get down there, you need to know. I might not be the same little girl when we come back up. Using the shutdown sequence will require me to interface directly with the temporal field. That kind of exposure changes people. Evan knelt down to her level, looking into those brown eyes that had already seen too much. Will you still be my daughter? Always. But I might also be something else, something new. She smiled, and for a moment she looked like a normal 7-year-old again. The children with no shadows told me that change doesn't have to mean loss. Sometimes it means becoming who you were always meant to be. They drove out of Pahrump in a convoy of 3 patrol cars and Evan's battered pickup truck, heading toward coordinates that existed on no official map. Behind them, the motel's neon sign flickered and died, as if their departure had somehow drained the electricity from the building. In the facility far below the desert, ancient machines began to hum with increased activity. The enhanced guards moved through corridors that existed in 17 different time zones simultaneously, coordinating defenses against an assault they had been expecting for 30 years. The children with no shadows pressed their faces against windows that looked out into tomorrow, watching their rescuers approach with a mixture of hope and terror. After all this time, someone was finally coming to take them home. The entrance to the old mining tunnel was exactly where Maisie's crystal map had indicated, hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural but was actually carefully engineered camouflage. As they cleared away the loose stones, Evan could see that the tunnel beyond was far more sophisticated than any 19th century mining operation. The walls are lined with some kind of metal, Sheriff Thompson observed, running his flashlight along the smooth surfaces. This isn't a mine, it's a service corridor. Waste disposal access, Maisie confirmed. They use it to remove byproducts from the temporal processing chambers. None of them asked what kind of byproducts required disposal from experiments involving children. Some questions were better left unanswered until they absolutely had to know. The tunnel sloped gradually downward, descending far deeper than any of them had expected. After 20 minutes of walking, Evan's ears began to pop from the pressure change. The air itself felt different, thicker, somehow charged with energy that made his skin tingle. "We're entering the outer temporal field," Maisie explained quietly. "Time moves differently down here. Our watches will start to drift." She was right. Ray's digital watch was already running slow, the seconds ticking by at an increasingly sluggish pace. Walsh's analog timepiece had stopped entirely, its hands frozen at 4:27. "How much farther?" Rodriguez asked. "Half a mile to the first checkpoint." After that, Maisie suddenly stopped walking, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. "They know we're here." The tunnel lights, which none of them had noticed turning on, began to flicker in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. But instead of dots and dashes, the rhythm conveyed something more complex, more nuanced. "They're trying to communicate," Maisie translated. "The enhanced guards, they want to talk." A figure emerged from the shadows ahead of them, moving with inhuman grace. At first glance, it looked like a young man in a security uniform, but as it drew closer, the abnormalities became apparent. Its eyes reflected light like an animal's, and when it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that made everyone's teeth ache. "You should not have come here," it said. But the words seemed to arrive from multiple directions at once. "The children are not ready for release." Sheriff Walsh had her weapon drawn, though she kept it pointed at the ground. "We're here to rescue the kids you're holding prisoner." "Prisoner?" The enhanced guard tilted its head, genuinely puzzled. "They are not prisoners. They are participants in the greatest scientific endeavor in human history. Through their sacrifice, we have unlocked the secrets of temporal manipulation." "You're torturing children," Evan said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "We are preserving them. In the processing chambers, they experience no pain, no aging, no loss. They exist in a state of perfect childhood, their quantum energy contributing to research that will eventually allow all humanity to transcend the limitations of linear time." Maisie stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same harmonic distortion as the guards. "I remember you. Your name was David Chen. You disappeared in 1987. The guard's inhuman composure cracked for just a moment. "That name. I remember that name. You were 8 years old when they took you. Your parents searched for months. Your mother still visits your grave every year, even though there's no body buried there. No, The guard's voice became unstable, shifting between frequencies. "I am a guardian of Project Lazarus. I've always been a guardian. I have no other existence. Your mother's name was Linda. Your father was Robert. You had a dog named Buster who slept on your bed every night after you disappeared." Maisie's words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You remember, David? You remember being human." The enhanced guard staggered backward, clutching its head as conflicting memories warred for dominance. "Stop! You're causing cascade interference in my neural matrix." "You're not a neural matrix. You're a child who was stolen from his family and turned into a weapon." Maisie reached into her backpack and pulled out one of the school photographs she'd been carrying. "This is you, David. This is who you really are." The photograph showed a young boy with dark hair and a shy smile, dressed in a school uniform from the 1980s. As the enhanced guard looked at it, its features began to shift, becoming more human, more recognizable. I remember this day. Picture day at Beatty Elementary. I wore my father's tie because I wanted to look grown up. Its voice was changing too, becoming younger, more uncertain. But that was so long ago. I've been here for centuries. 36 years, Maisie corrected gently. You've been experiencing temporal displacement. The processing chamber made you feel like time was moving differently, but in the real world, it's only been 36 years. My parents, are they still alive? Ray stepped forward, his voice compassionate but honest. Your father died in 2003. Your mother still lives in Beatty. She's been waiting for you to come home. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The inhuman aspects of the guard's appearance were fading, revealing the face of a man in his mid-40s who somehow still carried the features of the 8-year-old boy he'd been when he disappeared. Hose children in stasis, without constant maintenance. It becomes unstable. If the facility is compromised and we can't complete the shutdown sequence properly, this beacon will ensure that the children are released one way or another. The implication was clear. If they failed in their mission, the beacon would trigger a catastrophic failure that would free the trapped children but potentially kill them in the process. It was a dead man's switch with the highest possible stakes. "There are others like me," David said, his voice fully human now. Guards who were processed but not completely integrated with the quantum field. "If you can help them remember..." An alarm began sounding throughout the facility, a bone-deep thrumming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The tunnel lights flashed red, and the air began to taste of ozone and metal. "Security breach protocol initiated," an artificial voice announced. "All enhanced personnel report to defensive positions. Initiate temporal lockdown in sectors 7 through 12. "They know we're here," David said urgently. "The central AI detected my memory restoration. They'll be sending heavy units to stop us." "Heavy units?" Thompson asked. "Guards who were completely integrated with the temporal field. They're not human anymore. They're living weapons designed to protect the project at any cost." Maisie pulled out the temporal disruptor, its crystalline surface pulsing with increasing urgency. "This can neutralize their enhancement fields, but only temporarily. And we'll only get one shot, then we make it count," Evan said grimly. "David, can you get us to the central processing chamber?" "Yes, but you need to understand. What you're planning to do will free all the children at once. The shock of rapid temporal displacement could kill many of them. They've been locked in stasis for decades. Their bodies might not be able to handle the transition back to normal time, and if we don't do anything, they'll remain trapped forever, while the project continues to expand. Eventually, every child in the region will be processed. The ultimate goal is to create a temporal field large enough to encompass entire cities, entire states. Humanity will be preserved in perfect stasis, while a select few enhanced beings manage the eternal present. The weight of that revelation settled over the group like a shroud. They weren't just attempting to rescue a few hundred children. They were trying to prevent the enslavement of the entire human race. "How long do we have?" Walsh asked. David checked a device on his wrist that looked like a cross between a watch and a scientific instrument. "The next processing cycle begins in 90 minutes. If we don't reach the central chamber before then, 43 new children will be permanently integrated into the system. Then we move now, Rodriguez said. David, lead the way. As they proceeded deeper into the facility, the architecture around them became increasingly surreal. Corridors that seemed to stretch for miles in one direction appeared to be only a few yards long when viewed from another angle. Doorways opened onto rooms that were clearly larger inside than the spaces that contained them. The facility exists in folded space-time, David explained as they navigated the impossible geometry. Rooms can be bigger on the inside because they extend into parallel temporal dimensions. The children's processing chambers are located in spaces that don't technically exist in our timeline. They passed viewing windows that looked out onto chambers filled with sleeping children, each one floating in a column of soft light. The kids looked peaceful, almost angelic, but Evan could see monitoring equipment attached to their bodies, devices that measured and harvested the quantum energy generated by their trapped consciousness. "How do we wake them up?" he asked. "We don't," Maisie said quietly. "The shutdown sequence will collapse the temporal containment field all at once. They'll wake up naturally as time begins, flowing normally again." A new sound reached them from ahead, footsteps that echoed with unnatural resonance, as if each step was landing in multiple timelines simultaneously. David's face went pale. "Heavy unit," he whispered. "They've sent a chronarch." "What's a chronarch?" "A guard who's been integrated with the temporal field for so long that they exist in all possible timelines simultaneously. They can predict our movements because they can see every possible future." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a low humming that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Whatever was coming for them, it was unlike anything they'd encountered before. "There's something else you need to know," David said urgently. "The man who runs this place, Dr. Marcus Thorne, he's not just a scientist. He's the original test subject. He's been alive for over 200 years, sustained by quantum energy harvested from generations of children. Then he's the one we need to stop," Evan said grimly. "You can't kill him. He exists outside normal time. Death has no meaning for him. But if you can disrupt his connection to the temporal field, he'll age 2 centuries in a matter of seconds." The humming grew louder, and the walls around them began to shimmer like heat mirages. The chronarch was close now, and when it arrived, the real battle would begin. Maisie gripped her father's hand tightly. "Remember, Daddy, no matter what happens, we have to reach the central chamber. The children are counting on us." In the distance, the impossible footsteps grew closer, each one echoing across decades of stolen time. The chronarch emerged from a wall that should have been solid, its form shifting between multiple temporal states like a living double-exposure photograph. Sometimes it appeared as a young woman in a lab coat, sometimes as an elderly man in military fatigues, and occasionally as something that wasn't quite human at all. A figure composed of pure temporal energy wrapped in the memory of flesh. "You cannot proceed," it said, its voice a harmony of every age it had ever been. "The children are beyond your reach now. They exist in a state of perfect temporal suspension, protected from the chaos of linear time." David stepped protectively in front of the group. "I know you. You were Dr. Sarah Blackwood, weren't you? You disappeared in 1952 while researching temporal anomalies in the Nevada desert." The chronarch's form solidified briefly into that of a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair. "I remember that name. I remember having that life. But I have transcended such limitations now. I am eternal, unchanging, perfect." "You're a prisoner," Maisie said quietly, "just like all the others. They convinced you that enslavement was freedom. Child, you cannot understand. Through temporal integration, I've experienced every possible version of my existence. I have lived 1,000 lifetimes, seen every choice I might have made, every path I might have taken. This is evolution." Sheriff Walsh kept her weapon trained on the shifting figure, though bullets would be useless against something that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. "You're harvesting children's life force to sustain your unnatural existence. That's not evolution, that's parasitism. The children sacrifice nothing that matters. Their bodies remain perfectly preserved. Their minds dream eternal dreams. Meanwhile, their quantum energy powers research that will eventually eliminate death itself. All of humanity will share in this gift. Evan studied the Chronarch's constantly shifting form, looking for weaknesses. What about choice? What about the right to live normal lives? To grow up, to make their own decisions? Choice is chaos. Growth is decay. The linear progression of time brings only suffering and loss. The Chronarch gestured toward a viewing window that looked out onto one of the children's chambers. Look at them, peaceful, protected, preserved in the most beautiful moment of their existence. They will never know heartbreak, failure, or death. They'll never know love, achievement, or life either, Ray said grimly. The philosophical debate was interrupted by the arrival of additional enhanced guards, former children who had been partially integrated with the temporal field. Unlike David, who had regained his humanity, these beings still showed obvious signs of their transformation. Their movements were too precise, their expressions too vacant, their eyes reflecting light like mirrors. "Stand down," the Chronarch commanded them. "These intruders will be processed along with the scheduled subjects. Dr. Thorne wishes to study their temporal resistance patterns." "No," David said, stepping forward. "I remember who I am now. I remember what they stole from me." He turned to address the other enhanced guards. "Your names were Jennifer Morrison, Robert Walsh, Linda Chen, Mark Rodriguez. You were children when they took you. You had families who loved you, dreams of growing up, plans for the future." Some of the guards hesitated, their artificial composure wavering as suppressed memories began to surface. The Chronarch's form became more unstable, shifting rapidly between different temporal states. "Cease this disruption immediately," it demanded. "You are causing cascade failures in the enhancement matrix." Maisie pulled out the temporal disruptor, its crystalline surface now pulsing with brilliant blue light. "This is our chance. When I activate this device, it will temporarily disrupt all temporal enhancements in the immediate area. You'll have maybe 60 seconds to reach the central chamber before their systems come back online." "What about you?" Evan asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "Someone has to stay here and hold the disruption field stable. If it collapses too quickly, the enhanced guards will recover before you reach the shutdown console." "I'm not leaving you. You have to." "The shutdown sequence requires adult and child DNA from Grandpa Jack's family line, remember? You need me to get past the final security protocols." Maisie's brown eyes were steady, determined. "But first you need to reach the chamber. And that means I have to stay here and buy you time." David moved closer to the group. "There's another way. The service tunnels I use to access this sector, they connect directly to the central chamber. If you can get past the temporal barriers, you can reach Dr. Thorne's laboratory in 15 minutes. "What about the barriers?" "They're designed to prevent unauthorized temporal displacement. But Maisie's exposure to the processing chamber has made her quantum signature compatible with the system. She can guide you through the barriers if she maintains physical contact." The Chronarch was becoming increasingly agitated, its form cycling through temporal states with growing frequency. "You do not understand the consequences of your actions. The children's temporal patterns are delicately balanced. Any disruption could cause irreversible damage to their quantum matrices." "You mean it could kill them?" Sheriff Thompson said bluntly. "Death is a limited concept. Their consciousness would be scattered across multiple timelines, experiencing every possible moment of their existence simultaneously. Some might consider that a form of immortality, and others might consider it hell," Rodriguez replied. The enhanced guards were still struggling with their returning memories, their mechanical precision giving way to confused human emotions. One of them, a young woman who had been Jennifer Morrison, suddenly collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember my mother's voice. I remember my 10th birthday party that never happened because they took me 3 days before. The chronarch spun to face her, its form solidifying into something more threatening. Reintegrate immediately. Do not allow emotion to compromise your enhancement matrix. No, Jennifer said, rising to her feet. I've been their slave for 30 years. I won't be their weapon anymore. She turned to face the other guards, her voice carrying newfound strength. We were children. We had lives, families, futures. They stole all of that from us and convinced us we should be grateful. But we can take it back. One by one, the enhanced guards began to shake off their conditioning, their artificial composure cracking as humanity reasserted itself. The chronarch's form became increasingly unstable, its multiple temporal states bleeding into each other. This is impossible, it snarled. Enhancement integration is irreversible. You cannot simply choose to be human again. Choice is exactly what makes us human, David said. Something you forgot a long time ago. Maisie raised the temporal disruptor, its light now bright enough to cast shadows on the walls. Everyone ready? When I activate this, we'll have one chance to reach the central chamber. After that, the facility's security systems will adapt to prevent future disruptions. Evan looked at his daughter. This remarkable little girl who had survived horrors that would break most adults and emerged with the knowledge and courage needed to save hundreds of other children. I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Your mother would be proud too. She's watching, Maisie said with quiet certainty. All the families of the missing children, they're all watching. It's time to bring their kids home. She activated the temporal disruptor. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The chronarch screamed as its multiple temporal states collapsed into a single timeline, revealing a terrified woman who suddenly looked every one of her 100+ years. The enhanced guards staggered as their artificial enhancements failed, leaving them fully human for the first time in decades. But most significantly, the walls themselves began to shimmer and fade, revealing the true structure of the facility, a vast complex that extended impossibly far in all directions, filled with thousands upon thousands of stasis chambers containing children from across more than a century. My God, Walsh breathed. There are so many of them. Every missing child from across the western United States, David confirmed, his voice hollow with shock. They've been at this far longer than any of us realized. The facility's alarm systems were screaming now, automated voices announcing containment breaches and temporal cascade failures. In the distance, they could hear heavy footsteps, more guards responding to the emergency. The central chamber is through there. David pointed to a corridor that hadn't been visible before the disruption field activated. But you need to move fast. The temporal barriers will start rebuilding themselves in 40 seconds. Evan grabbed Maisie's hand and began running toward the corridor, the 4 sheriffs close behind. As they passed the viewing windows, he could see children beginning to stir in their stasis chambers, the first signs that the temporal field was destabilizing. Behind them, the chronarch was aging rapidly as her connection to the temporal field collapsed. You don't understand, she called after them, her voice becoming increasingly frail. Without the field to sustain them, the children will age to their proper timelines in minutes. Many of them will die from the shock. Then we better reach that shutdown console fast, Evan called back. The corridor ahead led deeper into the facility, toward a chamber where Dr. Marcus Thorne had been conducting his unholy experiments for over 2 centuries. Somewhere in that direction lay the master controls for Project Lazarus, and the key to freeing every child who had ever been taken. But first, they had to survive the journey through a facility that was rapidly becoming unstable as its temporal foundations collapsed around them. The countdown had begun, and failure would doom not just the children they were trying to save, but potentially reality itself. The corridor stretched impossibly long, its walls lined with windows that looked out onto chambers containing sleeping children. As they ran, Evan could see the kids beginning to stir, small hands moving, eyes fluttering open, lips parting, as if to call for parents who had been searching for them across decades. The temporal field is collapsing faster than expected, Maisie said, her small legs working hard to keep up with the adults. The children are starting to wake up, but their bodies are still locked in stasis. If we don't reach the shutdown console soon, the transition shock will kill them. Sheriff Martinez checked his weapon as they moved. How much farther? 200 meters to the central chamber, David called from behind them. He had chosen to follow despite his newfound humanity, driven by 30 years of suppressed guilt. But the emergency shutdown protocol has sealed the main entrance. We'll have to go through the auxiliary systems. The facility around them was becoming increasingly unstable. Sections of wall flickered between different time periods, sometimes showing modern concrete and steel, sometimes revealing the natural cave systems that had existed here for millennia. The air itself seemed to vibrate with temporal distortions. There, Maisie pointed to a service hatch marked with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. That leads to the waste processing systems. We can use it to bypass the sealed entrance. Sheriff Walsh examined the hatch. It's locked with some kind of biometric scanner. Not locked, Maisie corrected. Protected by temporal displacement. The scanner exists in 17 different time zones simultaneously. You have to provide the correct biometric signature in the right temporal sequence. She pressed her small hand against the scanner, and immediately the device began cycling through different configurations. Each time it changed, the symbols above the hatch rearranged themselves into new patterns. What's it doing? Thompson asked, reading my quantum signature. Because I was exposed to the processing chamber, my DNA carries temporal markers from multiple timelines. The system recognizes me as an authorized user. The hatch opened with a hiss of escaping air that smelled of ozone and metal. Beyond lay a cramped maintenance tunnel that pulsed with bioluminescent lighting. Emergency shutdown protocol, an artificial voice announced throughout the facility. All temporal containment fields will collapse in T-15 minutes. Personnel should evacuate to designated safe zones immediately. 15 minutes, Rodriguez said grimly. Can we make it? We have to, Evan replied, lifting Maisie into the tunnel before climbing in himself. The maintenance shaft was barely large enough for an adult to crawl through, but it provided direct access to the facility's core systems. As they moved through the cramped space, they could hear the sounds of the facility tearing itself apart, metal groaning under impossible stresses, electronic systems failing in cascades of sparks and smoke. The central AI is trying to contain the collapse, David explained as they crawled. But without the enhanced guards to maintain the temporal barriers, the entire system is becoming unstable. They emerged into a vast chamber that defied conventional physics. The space was simultaneously enormous and intimate, its dimensions shifting based on the observer's perspective. At the center stood a complex of machinery that looked like a cross, between a cathedral organ and a nuclear reactor, pipes and conduits rising toward a ceiling that seemed to extend infinitely upward, and standing before the central console was Dr. Marcus Thorne. He appeared to be in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of distinguished features that suggested wisdom and authority. But his eyes were wrong, ancient beyond measure, containing depths that spoke of centuries of accumulated knowledge and accumulated guilt. "Mr. Rourke," he said without turning around, "I've been expecting you for 30 years. Your father was quite persistent in his attempts to sabotage my work." "Your work?" Evan stepped protectively in front of Maisie. "You mean kidnapping and torturing children?" "I mean advancing human understanding of temporal mechanics by several centuries. Do you have any idea what we've accomplished here? We've conquered death itself. We've created a perfect state of existence where loss and suffering are impossible." Dr. Thorne finally turned to face them, and Evan could see that his apparent youth was an illusion. The man's skin had a translucent quality, as if he were being sustained by forces that weren't entirely natural. "The children you see in stasis, they are not suffering. They are experiencing eternal childhood, preserved at the most innocent and joyful period of human existence. Their quantum energy powers research that will eventually allow all of humanity to transcend the limitations of linear time." By stealing their lives, Sheriff Walsh said. Her weapon trained on the ancient scientist by offering them immortality. In the processing chambers, they dream eternal dreams. They play in fields of infinite possibility. They are free from the pain of growing up, of learning that the world is cruel and unfair. Maisie stepped out from behind her father. I remember the dreams you gave me. They weren't paradise, they were prisons. The children aren't playing in infinite fields. They're trapped in the same moment, experiencing the same day over and over again, slowly forgetting who they were. Dr. Thorne's composure flickered for the first time. You shouldn't remember the processing chamber. The memory wipe was specifically designed to prevent temporal displacement syndrome. The memory wipe didn't work because I'm my grandfather's granddaughter. Maisie pulled out Jackson Rourke's dog tag, its perforated surface catching the light from the central machinery. He built a back door into your systems, a way to restore the children's memories and free them from temporal stasis. Jackson Rourke. The name seemed to cause the ancient scientist physical pain. Brilliant researcher, completely unable to see the bigger picture. He focused on individual suffering instead of universal benefit. He focused on right and wrong, Evan said. Something you forgot a long time ago. Right and wrong are constructs of linear thinking. When you exist outside normal time, you develop a broader perspective. The temporary discomfort of a few hundred children is insignificant compared to the permanent elimination of human suffering. The central machinery began to emit a high-pitched whine, and the chamber's lighting shifted from white to red. Warning messages appeared on screens throughout the space, all indicating catastrophic system failures. T-minus 10 minutes to complete temporal field collapse. The facility's AI announced. Emergency evacuation protocols are now in effect. Dr. Thorne moved to the central console, his fingers dancing across controls that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. You've forced me to implement the final protocol. If I cannot preserve the children in temporal stasis, I will compress their quantum energy into a single concentrated burst. The resulting temporal explosion will preserve their essence in a state of pure possibility. That will kill them, David said, horrified. Death is a limited concept. Their consciousness will be scattered across infinite timelines, experiencing every possible version of their existence simultaneously. It is the ultimate form of immortality. It's torture, Maisie said simply. And I won't let you do it. She raised the dog tag, its perforated surface beginning to glow with soft blue light. The holes in the metal were indeed a punch card, a data storage system that Jackson Rourke had encoded with the shutdown sequence for Project Lazarus. The emergency shutdown protocol requires dual genetic authentication, Dr. Thorne said, his ancient eyes fixed on the glowing tag. Adult and child DNA from the Rourke family line. You cannot activate it alone. I know, Maisie said, reaching for her father's hand. That's why Daddy's here. Together, they pressed their hands against the central console's biometric scanner. The device immediately began analyzing their genetic patterns, cross-referencing them with Jackson Rourke's stored DNA profile. Dual authentication confirmed, the console announced. Emergency shutdown sequence ready for activation. Warning, this action will permanently disable all temporal containment systems. Proceed. Dr. Thorne lunged toward them, his movements unnaturally fast despite his apparent age. But Sheriff Martinez was faster, tackling the ancient scientist and bringing him down just short of the console. Do it, Ray shouted. Activate the shutdown. Maisie looked up at her father, her brown eyes steady despite the chaos around them. Are you ready, Daddy? Once we do this, there's no going back. I'm ready, Evan said. Let's bring those children home. Together they pressed the activation button. The moment Evan and Maisie activated the shutdown sequence, reality convulsed. The central chamber filled with blinding light as 2 centuries of stored temporal energy began to discharge all at once. The massive machinery that had sustained Project Lazarus screamed like a living thing as its quantum containment systems collapsed. releasing forces that had been held in check for generations. Dr. Thorne broke free from Sheriff Martinez's grip, his apparent youth stripped away as his connection to the temporal field severed. His hair turned white, his skin became deeply lined, and his ancient eyes filled with the terror of a man who could suddenly feel mortality approaching after 200 years of artificial immortality. "You don't understand what you've done," he gasped, aging visibly with each passing second. "The temporal cascade will propagate beyond the facility. You're going to destabilize time itself across the entire region. Then you better tell us how to contain it," Sheriff Walsh said, her weapon still trained on the rapidly aging scientist. But Dr. Thorne was beyond speech now, his body crumbling as centuries of delayed aging caught up with him all at once. Within moments, nothing remained but dust and the echo of his final desperate scream. The facility shook as the shutdown sequence propagated through its systems. Throughout the complex, stasis chambers began opening as their temporal locks disengaged. Children who had been sleeping for decades suddenly found themselves awake in a world that was collapsing around them. "The cascade is spreading faster than the safety protocols can contain it," Maisie said, her voice carrying an odd harmonic quality as the massive energy discharge affected her own temporal sensitivity. "We need to establish a new anchor point to prevent the destabilization from reaching the surface." "How?" Evan asked, struggling to stay on his feet as the chamber continued to shake. "Someone has to take Dr. Thorne's place as the temporal anchor. Someone has to absorb the excess energy and channel it safely into the quantum substrate." The implication hit him like a physical blow. "No, there has to be another way. There isn't time to find another way. The cascade will reach critical mass in 3 minutes. If it breaks containment, the temporal distortion will spread across 3 states. Millions of people will be caught in time loops or aged to death in seconds. Around them, the facility's systems were failing in spectacular fashion. Walls phased in and out of existence. Gravity fluctuated between normal and non-existent. The air itself shimmered with temporal distortions that made everything look like a heat mirage. Sheriff Rodriguez was helping David guide newly awakened children toward the emergency exits, while Thompson and Walsh worked to establish communication with the surface. But it was clear that the evacuation couldn't proceed fast enough to save everyone. "There has to be another way," Evan repeated desperately. "There is," came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Jackson Rourke standing in the chamber, not as a ghost or hallucination, but as a solid physical presence. He looked exactly as Evan remembered him from their final meeting 30 years ago, down to the worn flannel shirt and scuffed work boots. "Grandpa Jack?" Maisie whispered. "Hello, sweetheart. You've done very well. I'm proud of you." The older man's eyes moved to his son. "Both of you. You're dead," Evan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am. But death becomes somewhat flexible when you're dealing with temporal mechanics. I've been waiting in the quantum substrate for 30 years, maintaining a stabilization field around this facility to prevent exactly this kind of cascade failure." Jackson moved to the central console, his hands working controls with the easy familiarity of someone who had designed them. "I built multiple fail-safes into Project Lazarus, not just the shutdown sequence. I knew that eventually someone would have to contain the energy release manually. You're planning to sacrifice yourself again," Evan realized. "I'm planning to finish what I started. I've had 30 years to prepare for this moment, to study the quantum mechanics involved and develop a solution that will safely disperse the temporal energy without harming the children or destabilizing the region." The facility shuddered as another wave of temporal distortion swept through it. In the distance, they could hear the sound of awakening children, hundreds of voices calling for parents they hadn't seen in decades. "The anchor crystal," Maisie said suddenly, pulling the crystalline device from her backpack. "We can use it to focus the dispersal pattern. Instead of one person absorbing all the energy, we can spread it across multiple quantum signature anchors." Jackson studied the crystal, his eyes brightening with understanding. "Brilliant. The enhanced guards who regained their humanity, their quantum signatures, are already partially integrated with the temporal field. They can serve as distribution nodes. David, who had been helping evacuate children, overheard the conversation. "You want us to go back into the field? After we just broke free?" "Not permanently," Jackson explained. "Just long enough to serve as energy conduits. The crystal will distribute the load among all of you, preventing any single person from bearing the full burden. And if something goes wrong, then we all age rapidly and die," Jackson said honestly. "But if we do nothing, the cascade will kill thousands of people on the surface." Jennifer Morrison, the former guard who had remembered her humanity, joined the group. "How many of us would you need?" "All of you." "Every enhanced guard in the facility? The more distribution points we have, the safer the process becomes." One by one, the former guards gathered around the central console, men and women who had been children when they were taken, who had spent decades as unwilling servants of Project Lazarus, and who now had the chance to save countless others. "We'll do it," Jennifer said, speaking for the group. "We've been prisoners for so long. It's time we chose to be heroes instead." Jackson activated the temporal anchor crystal, its surface blazing with light that seemed to come from inside rather than outside. The device rose from his hands, floating in the center of the chamber and casting intricate patterns of light and shadow on the walls. "Form a circle around the crystal," he instructed. "When the energy transfer begins, you'll feel the temporal field trying to reintegrate with your consciousness. Don't fight it, but don't surrender to it either. Remember who you are, your names, your families, your humanity." The enhanced guards joined hands around the floating crystal, their faces reflecting both terror and determination. They had all lost their childhoods to Project Lazarus. Now they had the chance to ensure that the children they were saving would get to keep theirs. "Initiating energy transfer," Jackson announced, his hands moving across the console controls with practiced precision. "Beginning temporal cascade containment in 3, 2, 1. The crystal exploded with light, and suddenly every person in the chamber was connected through streams of pure temporal energy. Evan could feel the others' thoughts and memories, decades of imprisonment and suffering, but also hope and courage and the desperate desire to make their captivity mean something. The facility's collapse slowed, then stopped, as the cascade energy was safely channeled through the network of human anchors. Throughout the complex, children continued to wake up, but now their emergence from stasis was controlled and gentle. "It's working," Maisie said, her voice filled with wonder. "The children are aging to their proper timelines safely. They're going to be okay." But even as success seemed within reach, Evan could see the terrible cost. The enhanced guards, serving as energy conduits, were aging rapidly as the temporal field extracted payment for their service. Some would survive the transition, others would not. The price of freedom was always higher than anyone wanted to pay. In the distance, the sound of helicopter rotors announced the arrival of emergency response teams. Soon, children who had been missing for decades would be reunited with families who had never stopped searching for them. But first, they had to survive the next 60 seconds as reality reassembled itself around them. 6 months later, Evan stood in the small cemetery outside Beatty, Nevada, watching Maisie place wildflowers on a grave that finally had a body to mark. The headstone read, "Jackson Michael Rourke, father, grandfather, hero, 1952-2025. Some prices are worth paying." The old man had faded peacefully after the temporal cascade was contained. His quantum signature finally released from the burden he'd carried for 30 years. His last words had been from Maisie. "Take care of the others, sweetheart. They're going to need someone who understands." The others were the enhanced guards who had survived the energy transfer. Jennifer Morrison had aged 15 years in 15 seconds, but retained her humanity. David Chen had returned to his proper timeline as a 43-year-old man, reuniting with his elderly mother just weeks before her own peaceful death. 7 others had made the transition successfully. 4 had not, aging beyond their body's ability to sustain life in the process, but their sacrifice had saved 237 children. The reunions had been extraordinary and heartbreaking in equal measure. Children who had disappeared in the 1960s found themselves returned to grandparents who were now older than their parents had been when they vanished. Families that had spent decades searching suddenly had their missing children back, aged only hours or days, despite the passage of years. Not all the stories had happy endings. Some families had died out entirely, leaving children to be placed with distant relatives or caring foster families. Others struggled to reconnect across temporal gaps that made normal family dynamics impossible. But they were free, and they were alive, and they had the chance to build new lives in a world that had changed dramatically since their disappearance. Dr. Sarah Chen, the real Dr. Chen, not the enhanced being that had replaced her, had been found alive in a temporal stasis chamber deep within the facility. She now coordinated a support network for the rescued children and their families, helping them navigate the complex process of rebuilding lives that had been interrupted by forces beyond their comprehension. "The memorial service is next week," Maisie said as she arranged the flowers. At 7 years old, she looked like any other child, but her eyes still carried depths that spoke of experiences no child should have. The temporal exposure had left her with abilities that manifested in small ways, an uncanny ability to find lost objects, an intuitive understanding of complex systems, and dreams that sometimes contained glimpses of possible futures. "Are you ready for that?" Evan asked. "I think so. Mrs. Morrison says it's important to remember the ones who didn't make it home." The memorial would honor not just the enhanced guards who had died in the energy transfer, but all the children who had been processed completely by Project Lazarus over the past century. Their bodies had been found in the facility's lower levels, 612 children whose quantum energy had been completely drained, leaving nothing but empty shells that had been preserved in temporal stasis. Each child would receive a proper burial and a headstone bearing their name, age, and the date they disappeared. It was small comfort to families who had waited decades for answers, but it was the kind of closure that allowed the healing process to begin. "Daddy," Maisie said as they walked back toward their truck, "do you think Grandpa Jack knew this would happen when he first tried to stop the project?" Evan considered the question carefully. "I think he knew someone would have to finish what he started. Whether that was going to be us specifically or someone else, I don't know. But he prepared for this moment his whole life." They drove through Beatty on their way home, past the sites where the rescue operation had unfolded. The facility itself had been completely sealed and abandoned, its entrances filled with concrete and its existence officially denied by the federal government. But the town itself was slowly adapting to an influx of returned children and the families who came to claim them. The Riverside Motel had been converted into a temporary housing facility for families in transition. The library had become an informal meeting place where returned children shared their experiences and coping strategies. Even the local diner had adapted, offering comfort food to people who were struggling to rebuild lives that had been shattered by forces beyond their understanding. "Are you happy we did it?" Maisie asked as they pulled into their driveway. They'd moved to a new house after the old one was erased, a smaller place on the other side of town, but one that felt more like home than anywhere they'd lived since her mother's death. "Yes," Evan said without hesitation. "Those children deserve to come home. Their families deserve to know the truth. And you deserve to be free of the burden they placed on you." "I don't feel free exactly," Maisie admitted. "I still dream about the children who didn't make it. Sometimes I think about the ones who might still be out there, in other facilities we haven't found yet." It was a sobering thought. Project Lazarus had been vast, but investigations were ongoing into whether similar operations existed elsewhere. The government's official position was that the Death Valley facility had been a rogue operation conducted without authorization. But evidence suggested otherwise. "Maybe that's something you'll work on when you're older," Evan suggested. If that's what you choose to do, maybe. Or maybe I'll just be a normal kid who happens to have weird dreams sometimes." Maisie smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the carefree 7-year-old she should have been all along. Either way, I'm glad we brought them home. That evening, as Evan tucked his daughter into bed, she pulled out a small stone marker she'd been carving in art therapy. It bore the simple inscription, "For the children with no shadows, you are not forgotten." "Where will you put it?" he asked. "In the desert, where the facility used to be. Dr. Chen says it's important to mark places where difficult things happened, so future generations know not to let them happen again." Evan kissed her forehead, marveling at the wisdom and strength this remarkable little girl had developed through circumstances no child should have to endure. "I love you, sweetheart. Sleep well." "I love you too, Daddy, and don't worry. Tonight I'm just going to dream about normal 7-year-old things. Ponies and rainbows and maybe ice cream for breakfast." As Evan turned off the lights and closed her bedroom door, he found himself thinking about the future, not the dark, uncertain future that Project Lazarus had represented, but the bright possibilities that lay ahead for the children who had been freed and the families who had been reunited. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, monitoring equipment detected the faint quantum signature that remained where the facility had been sealed. The energy was dissipating slowly, safely, carrying with it the dreams and hopes of children who had finally found their way home. The 13-year cycle was broken. The children with no shadows had been set free, and in small towns across the American West, families were learning once again what it meant to believe in impossible things, like the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, the lost could be found and the taken could be returned. The desert wind carried those hopes across the endless landscape, whispering promises of better tomorrows to anyone willing to listen. Some endings were also beginnings. Some freedoms were worth any price, and some 7-year-olds would grow up to change the world, simply because they had been brave enough to remember who they really were when the darkness tried to make them forget. In the distance, a coyote howled, not in mourning, but in celebration of a darkness finally lifted from the land.